Are you afraid to fly? You're not alone. There are millions of you. And we'll talk about the top three causes behind that fear, and they may surprise you. We'll also offer some remedies and discuss our own experiences. Join us on this episode of Aviation Intrigue.
This is aviation, aviation intrigue.
I know a lot of people who are afraid to fly for a variety of reasons. And I know you looked at the research here, Elaine. What is the first reason that causes people to be fearful?
Well, there's a joke among pilots that some of us are afraid of heights because I, for example, hate ladders. I hate climbing up on ladders, climbing up on the roof. But flying is a little bit different. You're not at all connected to the ground, and I think that's where that opens that up to a lot of people being afraid to fly because it's really about a fear of falling from great heights. And that is why, for the human body, flying is actually unnatural.
So the fear of falling, aka fear of heights, when you're untethered to anything, that is very interesting. I'm not particularly afraid of heights, so it's kind of hard for me to understand, but seems like that is a very big cost.
Yeah, the fear of falling, if you think about it, it is so common for people to have dreams about falling. Have you ever been up on a ladder or climbing up on something and you feel like you took a misstep, and that instant fear of falling is just not anything you have control over. It just happens. So in our brains, we are just naturally afraid of falling. And if you think about it, that's what protects us. We are always cognizant of where we're stepping when we're climbing on something. We're always thinking about, okay, don't fall. And that can be anything from a few inches off the ground. Okay, don't fall off the step stool to, okay, I'm up thousands of feet in the air. Nothing's tethering me. That fear of falling can be really, really magnified. And that's where a lot of the fears of flying come about, because it is not something the human body was meant to do. Some of us have discovered that it's a really cool thing to do, but we do understand that a lot of people get anxious about it, and that's a big reason.
But that's probably similar to people who go on roller coasters where there's that fear of falling, but that's what the attraction is, that they bring you up, they build that suspense, and then woof, you go.
Yeah, and I for one love roller coasters, but I hate ladders, so it's hard to tell sometimes where that fear of falling can really kick in. But everybody's different, and so if you're not afraid of roller coasters, but you're afraid to fly, it could just mean the difference between not being connected to the ground and having a different fear of that sensation of falling a great distance. And so it's very real, and it's something that we should talk about because we can certainly help people if they're willing to address it.
So if I'm up in a ladder, I'm not sure if it's the fear of height, but I'm afraid that the ladder is going to slide under me, or a wind is going to come knock me over. That's what I'm afraid of.
And your fall,
is
yeah.
Is that basically the same thing in an airplane?
I think it's kind of the sensation because, again, if you think about the sensation of falling, it means that nothing is underneath you and your body isn't tethered to anything and you're falling. And I think that's that natural fear that is built into us, so that we're careful when we're climbing up that rock ledge or climbing on that ladder. But flying up high in an airplane is many steps beyond that. And so there's nothing you can do to be careful in an airplane. How can you keep yourself from falling? So I think that can sometimes magnify that fear. And that's maybe where some of the differences come in. I also at altitude, you don't exactly know where you are sometimes. And so that lack of awareness, I think, can cause some anxiety.
Yeah, and that ties into the cost number 2 that we will reveal later on. But I'm wondering, is this fear of falling, is that irrational, or is it grounded in some sort of science or physiology?
I think it's very natural and rational because we all want to be careful, again, when we're climbing up somewhere above the ground, or if you're about to do a bungee jump, for example. Okay, you know you're tethered, but maybe some of us have that little bit of anxiety, even though we'll go do it. Like, oh, I'm afraid that's going to break, and I'm afraid I'm going to fall. So I think that's always there in any respect. And some people have great fearlessness when it comes to that sensation of falling possibly happening. But maybe that's part of the thrill, like you mentioned with the roller coaster rides, that people will seek that out. But that, I think, that is still there in everyone. It's just part of the human brain, part of that self protection that's built in.
So, in an earlier episode, we talked about some of the reasons why accidents happen in a small airplanes. So, are people perhaps even worried that they're going to fall out of the sky and the wings are going to fall off, or is that possible?
Sure. A lot of that with aircraft definitely stem into, well, I'm afraid something's going to happen to the airplane and we're all going to fall to the ground. And that's where that can really be exacerbated into a real fear of boarding an airplane in the first place. And so I think images of airplane crashes can certainly cause enough stress in people to either magnify fears they already have or just start those fears, because those are the things that can trigger memories. And if anyone has ever had the great misfortune of being in an aircraft incident, that can also immediately cause that phobia, that fear of flying. And it can come from a number of reasons, whether it's due to an event or just due to something that's within you. But either way, that's why it affects so many people.
So, one of the things that I know and I have noticed is that when we're going through turbulence, and you see the plane kind of bounce up and down, especially if sudden loss, people get much more nervous. And I think the fears kind of accelerate at that point.
Yeah, that's a great point. I talk to a lot of people and they say, oh, I hate flying because of the turbulence. So a lot of that is going to be triggered if you hit bumpy air on an airline flight, which is really, really common, especially when you're lower to the ground on takeoff or approach. You're going to encounter that. And even though they try to inform you of that, which is one way of helping in order to not make it a surprise, people end up dreading it, like, oh, here comes the turbulence. And I think the reason for that is, if you think about it, and Gopal, you and I fly small airplanes where we're more susceptible to turbulence, it's a number of falling sensations, because you're going through rough air. And so the aircraft is literally going up and down a little bit. And I tell people that it's not harmful when it's just mild turbulence like that, but it's going to feel like you're driving your car down a bumpy, rocky road. You're going to be bumped around and it's not going to be comfortable, but there's nothing that's going to happen to the airplane, and it's safe. It's just going to be uncomfortable. But it does feel like you're coming up in your seat and then falling down many, many times. And I think that can cause those sensations of fear.
Right. I think that even people who are not naturally afraid of flying do tighten their seatbelts when there's turbulence, and maybe rightfully so. But the modern aircraft are designed to withstand a certain amount of turbulence, and we know from our own experience that our training teaches us how to handle a turbulence and how to assess what the turbulence is. And there are times where you want to get out of there because it just could put you in a danger. But most of the time, the pilots are making a good decision, and if they choose to be there, it's probably reasonably safe.
Sure. And especially in the airlines, they do have a lot of options for going up or down in altitude to escape turbulence, because trust me, the number one concern of flight crews when you're up there is encountering or avoiding turbulence. And so they do take great care at the times they can avoid it. Sometimes they can't. And then when you're flying light aircraft, Gopal, you also have the option of possibly changing your altitude if you have a long ways to go. But it's something that you can also get accustomed to, especially if you understand where the turbulence is coming from and the fact that the airplane could take a lot more turbulence than you or I could, actually.
Speaking of knowledge and how to avoid turbulence, what can people do to alleviate this thing? What should people be thinking about? Because we have two more causes to reveal, but let's tell them how we can deal with this.
Sure. Even though we can't control every encounter with turbulence that we do deal with, and avoidance is definitely the number one thing. But sometimes you just have to go through it for a little bit. I think understanding what turbulence is, and I like the rough road analogy, because it is very much what the airplane is experiencing, like bumps on a road. And I think having that understanding and that knowledge goes a long way to alleviating the fear, even though it's still not going to be comfortable for you. Hopefully, that can improve that bit of fear that you may have.
Yeah, I would also say that, let's say if it's thunderstorms outside, maybe listening to music or reading a book or something takes your mind off it. So you distract your mind from being worried about this, because most of the time it's not a dangerous situation. Your mind thinks it is.
That's a great tool for any fear, actually, is getting your mind off of it with some other distraction, something pleasant like music or movies or a book or even talking to somebody. That can definitely help. So if you think about those things when you're on a flight and you encounter turbulence, you can give those a try. They can go a long ways rather than feeling like you're dealing with that all alone.
Well, we have two more causes to reveal, but I am very curious to know if people out there agree with the number one cause, which is the fear of falling or the fear of heights being the reason for causing the fear of flying. So, Elaine, we talked about the first cause being the fear of falling. What is the second cause that we looked at in the research?
Even though this doesn't apply to everybody because people will still be afraid of certain things, I think in flying, a big factor is fear of the unknown. Flying is a big mystery. It can be anything from not knowing how an aircraft works. And by the way, what are all those funny noises that are happening in the aircraft? We talked about that in our aircraft episode. And I think when you put all that together and you're already a little bit anxious about turbulence and you're already anxious about a couple other factors that we'll talk about on an airline flight, that can definitely go a long ways to making someone fearful.
I think that makes perfect sense. And in general, when there's unknown or uncertain, your brain and your mind tends to imagine the worst case. We talked about bungee jumping or whatever. Your mind immediately goes to what happens if the bungee cord breaks, or what if the roller coaster breaks. So people start imagining all kinds of worst case scenarios.
Yeah, those are good analogies because I think from talking to people who are really, really afraid of getting on board an airline, they discuss not just the turbulence, which, as we talked about, just gives you this constant sensation of falling, but they're also afraid that something is going to go wrong with the aircraft. And sometimes it could be from seeing too many news videos of sensational airplane crashes or too many movies where there's fiery crashes and things like that. But that can also be a magnifier for people who are already afraid. And when you have these images in your mind and then you're getting on an airline, all of those images are going to come back and possibly make you a little bit more anxious than you already are. And so that's one thing I've heard from a lot of people when they say they're afraid to fly.
Yeah, in one of our earlier episodes of Aviation Intrigue, we talked about how driving may be even less safe statistically compared to flying, but our mind kind of takes all this imagery that you talked about and creates a worst case scenario. I'm thinking that for most people, getting in the car or getting in a train or getting in a bus is less scary, because it's almost like, well, if something happens, you just pull over and get off.
Yeah, absolutely. And everyone knows that when you're up in an airplane, you can't just pull over if you have a mechanical problem. You can't just drive a couple more miles to the gas station if you're low on fuel. So anything that goes wrong in an aircraft, definitely pilots are trained to take any abnormality seriously. And they're trained to understand what their options and alternatives are. But it's true, if you have something that's an emergency, you can't just pull over. And so being up in the air, again, not tethered to the ground, adds to that level of fear because of that. And so even pilots in emergencies, if something is going terribly wrong and they are doing the right thing, that anxiety level can build up because, again, you may be afraid of falling out of the sky or something causing a crash there. So I think that's built into every human being, including pilots. And so when you discuss the fears of flying, a lot of it can be the fear of the unknown. We talked in the last episode with aircraft accidents that training is a big key to that. And that is also akin to knowledge, that knowledge is something that can go a long way to alleviate fears of flying. So if you have a little bit better understanding of things like turbulence, how the aircraft works, what are those funny noises that are going on in the aircraft, and is that something to be concerned about? It goes a long way to alleviate any of those fears. And also knowing that if there is an abnormality, most of the time, the vast majority of the time, nothing is going to happen.
I'm going to imagine, and I don't know if this is a fact or not, but along with the fear of the unknown is the I don't know if to call it fear or not, but I can't control. I'm not in control. So not only it's unknown, but there's nothing I can do about it. Does that factor in?
I think that definitely factors in. This has happened to me a few times. This has happened to you where you're in the right seat of a car and your friend is driving and you see them speeding and making the turns too quick and then they ran a stop sign. I mean, how does that make you feel? It makes you feel fearful.
Yeah, feel out of control. That's exactly right. But in an airplane, that's going to be compounded because for people who don't know anything about airplanes, even if something is wrong, they can't really jump in and fly the airplane.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's definitely why that can feed the fear of flying is that you won't have control over anything that's happening, and that can definitely feed into it. So, how do we alleviate that? Well, it's hard to fix that without some training, but there are a few things you can do to help if you feel like you're not in control of the situation or there's a lot of unknowns going on, and that is just having a general understanding of how aircraft work, what the phases of flight are. We talked last time about taxiing, takeoff, en route, and landing, and just having this um, flight schedule in your mind can kind of help you visualize about well what's going on in a normal flight and all the things that go with it can go a long way to say okay, odds are nothing at all is going to happen on this flight, and this is how it's going to proceed. And if something out of the ordinary does happen, the more information we have about that, the less fearful we will be. And that's where, again, crews are trained very well to address anything that they know might concern the passengers. And so I think they've done a great job about that in the airline world.
Yeah, or go the other way, just like I said before, which is you go in your own world. You bring a book, you bring your iPad, you bring a Kindle, you bring your games, whatever, put your headphones on, get in your own world, putting their trust into the professionals who are flying the airplanes and the professionals who are maintaining the airplanes. And there's nothing you can do. So stressing over is not going to fix anything.
Definitely, definitely. But some people still have the fears, and we'll talk more about other tools people can use to help manage that because there are millions of people who are afraid to fly, but they have to. They have to travel for work or they have to travel for family reasons, and so it's a good idea to try to manage that if you can.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to say this, but because I love flying, but if flying is really causing anxiety that's physically making you sick or whatever, then maybe train or a boat or a car or there are other means of transportation.
Definitely. And even though we definitely want to encourage people to fly an aircraft, large or small, because it's a really cool piece of technology that has allowed people to travel long distances. It's not for everyone, and we definitely understand that. If it's a fear of flying that is so great and all the tools you've tried don't work, there's plenty of people who don't. If you recall John Madden, he was famous for not being that person who was ever going to get on an aircraft. And so when he was traveling, obviously, for his big business in the sports world, he had the best bus and the best bus driver that money could buy because he refused to get on any type of aircraft. And so plenty of people who have to travel for work sometimes just find other ways around it, and that's understandable.
Are you one of those people who are not going to get in an airplane no matter what because you're just fearful because you're of the unknown or the uncertain or the heights? Or have you found a way to get around it? Let us know in the comments because it's going to help a lot of people out. Okay, so far we covered the fear of heights or falling, and we talked about the fear of not being in control or fear of the unknown. What is the third one, Elaine?
This is something that I think a lot more people might be able to relate to, and that is claustrophobia, the fear of closed spaces. And that is something that can feed into a fear of flying because you are in a closed space, and that's very common.
Is that get exacerbated by the fact that you're in a seat belt with lots of people maybe in the middle seat? Or I don't feel claustrophobic in an airplane, so I'm not sure if that helps or hurts.
Oh, wow. So you don't get claustrophobic in a packed airliner full of people and you're in the middle seat and it's feeling stuffy in there? You don't feel claustrophobic?
I don't think I feel claustrophobic. I don't like people. I don't like crowded areas. But interestingly, I am claustrophobic in other areas. I
Hmm.
can't even watch on TV when somebody is in a small cave where they barely fit in some of the shows I see it. It makes me squirm. But in an airplane, small airplanes, big airplanes, I'm just fine. But I understand a lot of people feel claustrophobic even in a good passenger airliner.
Oh, sure. Airliners are obviously a lot bigger than closed boxes, crawl spaces, things like that. But I've talked to a lot of people who do not like flying on the airlines because they say, I feel claustrophobic. And so if you think about it, it's putting a lot of people into a long metal tube and it's all closed in and very tightly sealed, obviously, so that flight can happen. And by the way, you're buckled in and you're told to keep your seatbelt on, and you may be on a full flight that's elbow to elbow with people, and a lot of people feel claustrophobic. They feel closed in, they feel trapped, they feel like they can't breathe sometimes if they start getting anxious, and that can all lead to wanting to avoid flying in the first place.
I am an aisle seat kind of a guy when I fly in an airliner. I wonder if sitting by a window helps with the claustrophobia.
Yeah, don't tell anybody this, but the window seat goes a long way to alleviating that. I always try to get a window seat when I'm flying on an airline, and mainly it's because I like to look outside. I like to look down at the clouds and the sky, or the ground if you can see it. So I just have fun with that, and sometimes that can help people with claustrophobia, though, because there's an open space that they can look at. And we talked about distracting yourself from a fear that can go a long ways to making you forget that you're in a tightly packed metal tube and that you can't move around too much. So the aisle seat could actually maybe be a good alternative to that, because you can see that there's a little bit of space between you and the aisle and the next row of seats, and you're able to maybe look around a little bit, maybe move a little bit more than you could. And I think that uh, the big thing with the middle seat, which everybody hates if they can avoid it, is that you are not able to move around too much, and people may feel even more claustrophobic in that. So sometimes avoiding the middle seat can be really the only strategy you might have if the airline is full.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say is that the aisle seats, I can look and I can see up and down the airplane. And to me, that feels a bit more spacious. But I do understand that if you're on the window seat looking to especially if it's daytime and you can see outside, it's pretty good. In nighttime, it doesn't matter. Or if the shutters are down, it doesn't.
Yeah, sometimes when you have to close the window shades, like on an international flight, I always try to see if I could keep it halfway open, because I do like having a little light or a little sky to look at. But sometimes you do have to close it, and then even though I don't feel claustrophobic, it definitely feels like, wow, I am a little bit more closed in on this because I can't see outside. So that could be just a very mild form of that, so to speak.
I have to imagine that certain population, certain percentage of even pilots and flight crew have some level of claustrophobia, maybe.
Yeah, I think it's really common. People talk about how they hate, let's say, having to get an MRI because you're lying in a very, very tight tube that's closed in all around you. And that's another common form of claustrophobia I've heard of, where it could be small spaces, like you mentioned. That's what you don't like, as well as being on an airline where it still feels like it's closed in. And so that, I think that's a common sensation. To throw in our small airplane world, I don't think claustrophobia is as much of an issue, if not at all. Maybe you can talk about passengers if they've ever reported that. But because you can see all around and you're just in a very small cabin with 2 or 4 seats and there's windows everywhere, I don't find that I've observed claustrophobia in that situation. And that's kind of the cool thing about smaller aircraft.
Yeah, going back to the MRI, I used to work in the MRI industry, so I could not get in an MRI machine. I had something about being horizontal and confined, and I think more than claustrophobia, the fact that I felt like I could not escape if I wanted to. That's what bothered me. And that's why, like in an airplane, I can always take off the seatbelt and walk around, I suppose. But speaking of small airplanes, I think you make a good point. I feel, in my experience, is that people, when they get into a small plane, that space looks a lot smaller than it is inside. So I think that when you're walking into a small plane, just like walking into a small car, it feels like a very constrained space. But once you're in it, you have windows, you can see pretty much, and so it's not as constrained as perhaps it looks from the outside.
Sure, and I think that that can also explain the difference why some people get airsick on an airliner and not in a small aircraft. For those who've experienced that, because of the plentiful windows where you can look outside. Another symptom of claustrophobia that I think we should mention is air sickness, because for some people, if they can't look outside at the sky or have a good orientation of what's going on with the aircraft, there's been a lot of reports of people feeling airsick, and that can definitely feed into some anxiety or fear of flying. Like, well, I get airsick every time I fly, and I'm feeling closed in, and I feel like I can't get up and walk around or breathe heavily because it seems kind of closed in there. And so, if you put all that together, that's not a fun feeling to have. And so, I can definitely understand some of that coming together to be afraid of flying.
Yeah, I'm not air sick. I think I got sick in like buses and boats when I was much younger, like a toddler, but somehow I grew over it. Um, Sometimes I find that my son once threw up sitting in an airplane. I don't know. They had these airplanes where the seats were facing backwards. So you're facing the tail
Oh,
of the
like club
airplane.
seat. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, and he did not like that at all. So sometimes the position of where you're sitting in the airplane makes a difference.
Oh, that's a good point. Most airliners have forward-facing seats, so you may not encounter that. But some larger aircraft do have what we call club seats, some that face forward and some that face back. And if you've ever been on a train, that's very, very common to have seats facing the other way. And that's interesting. Some people may have to test that out to see if there's a preference with forward facing or rear facing, because apparently it does happen where people can get motion sick that way.
Do you get motion sick? Are you claustrophobic? We would like to hear from you. Are there tricks and tips that you can give others on how you overcome it? So, Elaine, we gave three reasons: the fear of falling, the fear of the unknown, and claustrophobia or being in small spaces. What kind of remedies do you think people are using that you have heard of?
Hopefully, people can manage these in the few ways that we discussed. So, if you feel like it's fear of the unknown, having a little bit better understanding of what's going on during a flight can go a long ways to reduce anxiety. And by the way, don't watch airplane crash movies right before you go on a flight. Do what you can to manage those fears, especially when you know you'll be getting on board something sometime soon. And for claustrophobia, that can mean anything from trying to have a little bit of management of where you're sitting and what kind of flight you're getting on and dealing with turbulence and all of those things. But we hear a lot about people seeking or taking medication. There's certainly a lot of common medications for air sickness, but in terms of relieving anxiety, sometimes people may have to go that route.
Yeah, I know there are some over the counter remedies. And then if people are seriously claustrophobic or seriously anxious, I'm sure medical professionals will be happy to tell them how to overcome that.
Sure. Sometimes, in terms of therapy or prescription medications, we are not here to give medical advice, but these are some of the things we've heard people do to address their fear of flying. I've heard of a lot of people saying, well, they're going to take something to be like a sleep aid so that they will fall asleep for most of their flight. I find that that has been a really, really common way for people to deal with either fear or motion sickness, or if they're feeling claustrophobic. Just going to sleep for most of that flight can help them just not have to deal with those sensations during what could be a long flight, 2 or 3 hours sometimes.
So, do you experience fear of flying, or do you know people who have experienced fear of flying, or do you have a way for people to overcome that or deal with that? Please let us know, because we think that this is a much more common problem than perhaps people realize, and then we can help other people with this. Thank you for joining this episode. We have some amazing episodes teed up for you, so please join us next time here on Aviation Intrigue.
Aviation